All right, new day. We're going to be talking about legal terms today. So here's a sampling of all those legal terms that we're going to know. So we're going to start with assumption of risk. So on your paper, assumption of risk will be somewhere on there, and failure to warn will also be there. I feel like these go together. So there's a sign on the fence that says, "Warning: there is a risk of injury when participating in sport at this centre." So it must be like British or something. So, okay, that's kind of saying, hang on a minute. If you get injured here, don't come at me with some kind of lawsuit. So that's basically what people are trying to do is go, you knew when you signed up. So assumption of risk. Let's say you're a football player since football is in season. At the very beginning of the season, your coach should have given you some kind of a form that said, hey, football has these inherent risks. So one of them is like concussion. You can break bones. You can sprain ligaments or strain muscles. All kinds of things can happen in football, and we've seen it happen in football. So the coach should have at some point said, hey, if you play, there is this chance that you could get injured. And that's the assumption of risk that the individual takes on. And the coach needs to warn those people of those risks. So it'll be in a waiver. Basically, it says you could all kinds of things could happen to you. So athletes sign waivers all the time for this. Okay, informed consent. So I'm gonna go with my mom's story on this one because she just went through cancer treatment. So she ended up with first she did chemo, and then she did radiation, and then she's had surgery to have whatever is left of the tumor cut out. And before each of those procedures, they would bring her forms that said, okay, you're about to undergo this procedure, here's what can happen. So in the case of surgery, I had to do this as well when my appendix just freaking gave out last year. They gave me a paper, and I was in all kinds of pain. It's real that there's pain associated. So they'll bring you a paper that's like, you could die. I just remember they'd give me some drugs, and I was a little bit out of it, and they were telling me I could die, and I felt like I needed to talk to my kids and whatever. But I had to basically go like, okay, I understand that by going under the knife, I could risk my life, and I could actually just end up without an appendix, which is what happened. But you just have to sign that and move on. Basically, the idea is to go, protect yourself, protect yourself, protect yourself. If we lived in a society where people actually cared about each other, we wouldn't need this so much. But we live in a very litigious society, unfortunately. And that's just kind of the way it falls. We got to protect ourselves. Okay, there is a standard of care. So if this is the doctor, we expect that he went to medical school just like every other doctor, and we expect a certain level of experience and expertise from a doctor. Or if it was a physical therapist, we would want it to be the same as other physical therapists, and we expect prudent care from that person based on their training. There's a standard of care that's set. Okay, lots of pictures on this one because it could mean lots of things. So kind of think of if you've ever been on a long car ride with your siblings and maybe you're fighting over the space between or something and you're kicking each other. Well, that kicking each other, technically, they probably didn't like it. And that is touching someone without their permission. So next time your sibling is like, you can be like, that's battery. And there you go. See, I thought we'd throw siblings in there so I found twins fighting, and I don't think they're fighting. He's just trying to eat his hand. And then Salt is fighting a battery for sure. This guy's getting, I think, his own fist to the face, but maybe he didn't know it was coming. And yeah, you don't ever need to grab someone from behind when you're walking past them. I don't know what that's about. Battery, touching someone without their permission. Okay, so commission and omission, I thought these kind of went together. They might be in different places on the notes. But if you look at root word of each of these words, one is commit and one is omit. Commit and omit. So to commit, say, a crime, that means you actually did the crime. And to omit something means to leave something out. So, trying to think of a good example of this. Okay, I don't know why this came to my brain, but I've kind of thought about this one in the past too. So Michael Jackson, his doctor gave him drugs, and most people, when they kind of hear about what the drugs were that he was given and the doses that he was given, they expect a standard of care. This is a doctor, a medical doctor who's supposed to do no harm, and he's giving him drugs that a reasonable person, in this case another doctor, would not give him. So that's committing something. They're doing something, okay, versus failing to do something that a reasonable person would do. So boy, in a COVID world, like when you don't wash your hands, or like who needs soap, like our little omission. Let's go. If you know for a fact that someone got a concussion, or like you saw him hit heads pretty hard, your coach, you saw it happen, but that's your good player, and a reasonable coach would pull that kid out because that kid's probably facing stuff like brain damage in the future. But maybe that coach is like, but I like winning. And so he throws him back in. That's something a reasonable person would not and should not do. So commission and omission. So sometimes you're talking about, did you tell a lie? That's commission. Or did you just leave stuff out that should have been in? That's kind of another way to think about it. Okay, then I thought these two kind of went together, because liability simply means legal responsibility to act in a reasonable and prudent manner. So if you are a doctor, most of them carry some kind of medical insurance, malpractice insurance, because they do have a standard of care. They are expected to act in a way that is beneficial to the patient. And when they don't, then they assume liability. Okay, so an example that I'll give in a minute when I go through how you prove this will have to do with the sponge counter. Okay, so malpractice is essentially kind of when they commit the negligent act while providing care. So if it's a doctor and let's say they're like snip snap and they snip snap the wrong thing, or in certain cases they've had left side, right side problems, or they thought maybe they were supposed to do the surgery on this side and they ended up opening up the wrong place. They've left stuff in. We'll talk about how that can happen. So usually in 99.999% of cases, it's a case where they didn't mean to do it, but they do. We expect this standard of care, and something bad happened under their watch, if that makes sense. So what is it? What is negligence? So that's when you would have to, like, if a person said, you were negligent with me as a patient, then we'd have to prove it. So in order to prove it, we use the acronym, or I use the acronym DBIP. And that is the acronym, is DBIP. So to prove it, we have to understand first the D, that the person has a duty of care. Okay, so I'm going to give you a story about my sister-in-law's sister who went in to get a hysterectomy. She goes in to get a hysterectomy, has the surgery, and then about a month after she's out, she's like, I just don't feel right. I don't feel good. Feels like my guts are falling out. And she went to the doctor and she explained to the doctor, hey, listen, feels like my guts are falling out. And the doctor's like, well, we took some guts out. I mean, we did take your uterus. And she was like, no, it just feels like they're falling out of me. She feels like my guts are falling out. That's what she kept saying. And the doctor was like, you're good. Sent her on her way. Did that a couple of times. So she came back a couple of times. They were like, you're good. And then like third time, they're like, well, let's take a look. That's typically what they'll do. Is like, they're not going to use the expense. They're not bringing out the big guns, the expensive equipment until it's absolutely necessary. She was there like third time saying, listen, my guts are falling out. And they're like, we better check to see if her guts are falling out. So they do a scan on her, and it turns out they left a sponge in her. Okay. So I want you to think about this one job that the sponge counter had. He had one freaking job, dude. So there was like 10 sponges here. Operate, operate, operate. There should be 10 sponges here, right? But maybe he counted one twice, or maybe he was like, yeah, who cares? It looks like I got them all. Whatever it was, there was a sponge left inside. It was uncomfortable. It made her feel like her guts were falling out. She had to miss work for it. So, first of all, there was a sponge counter. And I'm pretty sure that was the title of his job. Sponge counter. He had a duty of care. There was a breach of that duty. That's the B. Breach of that duty. That means he didn't follow through with his duties. And because of that, the I is injury or harm. Injury or harm. And that could be that she felt off for a long time. That she felt like stuff was falling out of her for a long time. That can't be comfortable, right? And then the P stands for proximate cause. So we could point back to that professional to say, it's your fault. And that's how we prove negligence. So the sponge counter, did they have a duty of care? Sure did. Your name is sponge counter, idiot. And then was there a breach? Well, was there a sponge in her? There surely was. So yes. Did it cause injury or harm? Kind of. It did, because she was uncomfortable, and she didn't have to be uncomfortable. She could have just had the operation and gone on with her life. And then was the person the proximate cause? And the answer was yes. So then we start to get into ethics and go like, well, what does she do? And we could have that discussion in class, and maybe we will, because maybe that's where Americans should be talking about, like, how can we tweak things a little bit? Maybe if we all just chill out and be nice to each other. Can you imagine? Our country would be so much nicer. Okay, in the case of a legal battle, there is what's called a statute of limitations. So if you had something happen to you like 10 years ago, and you went, remember that one time 10 years ago when that happened to me? And you try to take him to court, the statute of limitations depends on what the crime is. So things that are like way more intense, say like rape or murder or something like that, you would have a longer statute of limitations. But in the most case, I'm just going to highlight this line. The statute of limitations for some cases is as short as 6 months, and then depending, you could go even decades after. So I would imagine, like, because I taught forensics, the serial killers that they finally catch, that maybe their very first one and last one were 20 years ago, but they still killed like 25 people. They want to hold that person to account. So I added this little blurb. A medical malpractice action against any healthcare provider must be brought within 2 years of the date when the injury was or should have been discovered. So that's according to Utah law. Okay. Lastly, we're going to stop here today. The Good Samaritan law. So a lot of times when we start talking about injuries and what could happen on the field or the court, and then we're like, well, should I act or not? Because I don't want to have stuff like, this happened to me if I don't get it quite right. But let's just say you're there, you're acting in good faith, you act based on what you know, you don't actually intend for bad things to happen. But look, if the car was on fire and this person could potentially have a spinal cord injury, but the car's on fire and you pulled the person out of the car, and maybe by pulling them out, you caused the spinal cord injury to be worse, they would basically look at that situation and go, but they were going, do they die by burning, or do we risk them actually being paralyzed? So there is a Good Samaritan law in place as long as you're acting in good faith and doing what makes sense in that situation. Then you're good. That's the Good Samaritan law. So we'll stop there today and get right into ethics and issues next time. We'll be debating some things. So until next time.